I'm Peter Ware. I run the Swift Institute. All week long in this room, if you haven't been in this room before, we've had academics from a variety of great universities around the world giving 45-minute lectures on topics ranging from regulation, cyber, fintech, and so on. Today we've got quantum computing. If anyone can understand quantum computing, you're a better person than I am. We've got someone here who's going to try and explain what it is and what it means for the financial services industry. We've got Michel Mosca, who is at the University of Waterloo. He's co-founder of the Institute for Quantum Computing. He's one of the world's leading experts on quantum computing. So, Michel, over to you.
Thanks so much. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to speak to you today. If I could just quickly ask, how many in the audience work in cybersecurity? Sort of familiar with the basics there. What about risk management, governance, oversight, regulation? Okay, great. We don't have to get it. We're not going to get into the guts of quantum mechanics, so there's no need to worry. But I will, have to try to answer the inevitable question of what is a quantum computer before I try to outline what it means for financial services. So let's start with what a classical computer is, okay? Because there's many different ways to represent information. It gets input into a computer, gets processed, and it's output in many different formats. But deep inside, in the guts of a computer, ultimately, information is stored in bits. In some physical system, we don't really care what it is, transistors that somehow encode a 0 and a 1. So our information, whether it's photographs or text or voice or whatever, is encoded in some bits, manipulated according to some very simple rules, and then output in some meaningful format. So a quantum computer is simply a device. It's a supplement to a regular computer. So it's a special kind of chip where those bits that can encode 0 and 1 can also harness the quantum principles of physics, the quantum laws of physics. So what does that mean? Quantum mechanics tells us, all quantum mechanics is, the one-line summary, it's a language that lets us talk about a physical system that can be in two or more distinguishable states. It allows us to talk about it being in all of those configurations at the same time, whatever that means. Okay? That was the missing link to resolve a number of paradoxes in physics just over a century ago. So it's just a half page of mathematical rules that says this is the language you use to talk about physics. And a quantum bit is simply a bit that can somehow represent 0 and 1 at the same time. So these 128 bits can represent all 2 to the power of 128. So 2 times 2 times 2, right? 2 to the 40 is a trillion. 2 to the 80 is a trillion, and so on. So it's many, many different ways of configuring all the... We couldn't, in the lifetime of the universe, just count through all the possible configurations of these 128 bits. Yet a quantum device can somehow explore all those configurations at the same time. It's not a free lunch. It's not like having 2 to the 128 independent processors, but there are certain problems where a device that, deep under the hood is somehow embodying all 2 to the 128 configurations at the same time. It can solve some problems astronomically faster than we ever thought was imaginable. Not faster because of clock speed, faster because it just takes many, many fewer steps, right? So quantum mechanics give us a deeper insight into the nature of reality, and essentially there's shortcuts to get from the input to the answer you want. So that's what's going on deep inside a quantum computer, and it leads to a host of new applications. We're only scratching the surface right now, which is only natural because the devices aren't yet available at the level that we need to do the interesting things yet. And so we're still just scratching the surface in terms of figuring out what they're good at. But we already know they'll help us design new generation materials, help us optimize the testing and design of drugs, production of fertilizers, and so on, optimize the systems and processes. And the earlier stage technologies, so the quantum computer is sort of often called the Holy Grail, or it's sort of it's the moonshot. It's one of the main ambitions of fully harnessing the power of quantum mechanics. But along the way, we can use smaller scale quantum devices to get much greater sensitivities than we ever thought was possible. So a new generation of sensors for medical imaging and other forms of imaging. And I'll talk briefly about secure communication. It's also a new tool that allows us to build new cryptographic foundations that are stronger than the ones we had before. But really, we were only scratching the surface. So there's great enthusiasm to be home to the next, one of the next technological revolutions, as it's sometimes called. So there's great enthusiasm to build these devices. However, one of the problems that we previously thought were intractable, but suddenly become tractable, is a very uninteresting mathematical problem of taking a large number and computing its factors. Right? So it's easy to take two numbers and multiply them and compute the product. But if I give you the product and say what were the factors, in general, that's very, very hard. If the number's a few hundred digits long, we just don't know how to do it with today's computers. And this is actually a fundamental part of how internet security works right now. Everyone, organizations around the world, they publish their product of the two numbers. It's called their public key. Your browser has dozens and dozens of them cooked into them. So all of your devices have hundreds, dozens at least, perhaps hundreds of large products of two primes. Right? And the owners of those public keys, they're not secret, they're public, but the owners of the factors, they're the ones who can, for example, sign code. How do you know when you do auto updates every day that really is coming from Microsoft or Apple or whoever, right? It's because they know the factors of their public key. With the public key, you can verify the code is authentic, but only the owners of the private keys of the factors can sign the code, for example. However, with a quantum computer, factoring becomes easy. So that's a very serious challenge to cryptography. So in particular, so let's just go through a basic transaction. You buy something online. So you use an RSA or ECC-based signature to verify that really is the vendor, right? That'll be broken and decimated. It's not just weakened. You can't just go to a larger key. Then you use an RSA or ECC-based algorithm to establish a secret key. Right? That will be broken. So you don't have a secret key anymore. And what you normally do with the secret key is use something like an AES encryption algorithm to encrypt your credit card and send it through that, hopefully, private channel. The encryption is weakened, but not shattered, right? So if you want the 128 bits of security that we often aspire to, it more than suffices to go to AES with 256 bits of keys. So bit strength is a notion that, very simply speaking, the number of bits, if it's 80 bits of security, it means we believe it takes 2 to the power of 80, so a trillion times a trillion steps to break that code. And 2 to the 80 is a lot, but it starts making people nervous. Most people aspire to 128 bits of security these days. But two of the most important primitives we use every day, authentication, signatures, so we know who we're talking to, right? How do we trust that code? How do we know we're buying from the legitimate party? And establishing the secret symmetric keys, which we can then use to encrypt. Both of those, what is deployed today is shattered. So what does that mean? Again, to most people, these 3 to 5 letter acronyms don't mean anything, but they underpin secure web browsing, auto updates, VPNs, secure email, blockchains. So it's not just what we have today, but the new systems we're going to deploy tomorrow. If you're in any way using untrusted infrastructure, the internet, wireless communication, you're probably using crypto. Right? So essentially it underpins all of our ICT. So that's a serious problem. Okay? If quantum computers were available today, it'd be a global catastrophe. But we don't have them today. So does that mean we can just sit back and worry about everything else? You still have to worry about everything else. But can you ignore this for the time being or not? And this is what I've been asking myself and being asked since the 1990s. And the answer has always been, well, that depends. Okay? So different stakeholders have a different answer to this question. It depends very simply on 3 questions, or the answers to 3 questions. What's the security shelf life of the information you're dealing with? And for many people, it's 0 years. It doesn't need to be confidential, and I don't even care about the integrity beyond a few seconds or a few days. But it could be 10 years, could be 100 years. Your regulators might say it's 7 years or you go to jail or whatever. There's many different parameters here, many different consequences for not meeting it. The other question is, how long does it take you to migrate to new tools that will resist these emerging attacks? If you fully control the system, you could maybe do it in 5 years, say, some number of years. If you don't, it might take you 10 to 15 years to migrate to a new quantum-resistant algorithm. If you need standards and you have to work with your competitors and vendors and so on. And then lastly, how long before large-scale quantum computers break our current infrastructure? Call that Z. So for the next Y years, you're stuck with the current quantum vulnerable tools. Because by definition, you haven't had time to deploy tools that will resist these attacks. You're supposed to be providing X years of security, confidentiality, or integrity. Except if X plus Y is bigger than Z, you're not. Okay? You have a problem. So if you have a 10-year requirement on your data, and you think it'll take you just 10 years to migrate, but quantum computers come in 15 years, you have a problem now. You're already too late. Because at the end of those 10 years, you're not going to be able to provide those 10 years of security. So then what? Okay? Maybe it's not a big deal. Maybe it's a catastrophe. Right? So X plus Y is bigger than Z means information will not be secure for as long as it's supposed to. If Y is bigger than Z, then systems actually collapse. So it's not just that eventually the data will be compromised. It's no, the systems don't work anymore because the crypto that's protecting it is fundamentally broken. Another important thing to keep in mind, when you go to the next talk today, you'll see that most cyber attacks are not the ones we know of aren't due to bad crypto or crypto being broken. There's many other reasons, and they often exploit bad implementations and design flaws, among other things. If you rush to the deployment of new foundations of your entire cyber infrastructure, there'll be many, many mistakes that will provide hackers years of opportunities, and it will be very expensive and disruptive. It will not be cheap if you wait. If it's Christmas Eve, 1999, when you decide to deal with the Y2K problem, it's not going to be cheap or very good solution. And this is, of course, much, much more complex than that. And now, none of these three facts motivate much short-term behavior changes, even though logically we know if we don't start now, we're not going to be ready and it's going to be very, very bad. What actually happens if I do nothing for another 6 months? Well, not much. So that's a problem. It's a human problem with many problems facing humanity. But I think that's starting to change. I'm seeing signs that experts in the IT space are no longer allowed to just give the bovine stare when they're asked, what about the quantum threat? They have to at least pretend to know something, right? And so they have to have some kind of opinion, and some of the opinions are even half decent or quite good. So it's very quickly changing where people have to know something and people have to start articulating that they have a plan in the short term. So it could be a short-term business differentiator. Okay, so I urge everyone to do their XYZ analysis and figure out how much time they have and make sure they're ready in time. Okay? So what is Z? We get asked all the time. I've been asked since 1996. So we don't know. It's a hard thing to know for two reasons. There's two things that we have to keep track of. One is, how big of a quantum computer do we need? Is 100 physical bits enough? Do we need a million, a billion? Right? Right now, today's estimates, based on some reasonable assumptions, you need a few 100 million physical qubits, say, tens to hundreds of millions. That's a lot. However, by improving the algorithms and the compilation of those algorithms and the way we correct the errors, that number is continually going down. So it's a downward moving curve. You can't perfectly predict it, but we know it's going down in terms of how big of a quantum device we need to be a threat. Then there's the upward moving curve in terms of how close are we to having those physical resources. Now, how many physical qubits you have is a bit oversimplified. There's 7 key milestones to having a large-scale quantum computer. And we're not at the point where we're just trying to build bigger computers. we're trying to build the fundamental building block. So it's dozens of those physical bits, dozens or hundreds, behaving like one noiseless bit. Once we have that design, and we could be very close, we could be a couple years away. Again, we don't know, but we're really getting close. Then, because these first few stages are very exploratory and it's all about physics and there's just a handful of people working on this in the 90s. We're very close to a design which can then, where the focus can shift to engineering, not completely, but intense focus on engineering and scaling those systems. Right? And there's already been some thought in what it takes to scale such a design. So already anticipating the scaling phase. Now before I say a bit more about these scalable fault-tolerant quantum computers, so the reason we don't have them yet is because they're inevitably prone to errors. And it's very, very hard, not impossible, but difficult to correct the quantum system, because you have to correct it without looking at it. It's possible. We know how to do it. We just have to actually implement the devices to do it. There is an approach that bypasses that middle step, right? Creating this effectively noiseless quantum bit so we can implement all the algorithms we can design, right? They're saying, what if we integrate a bunch of noisy quantum bits, not completely noisy, but too noisy to do the error correction that we know? Can it still do something useful? And the answer is maybe. We don't know yet. Okay? But there's a whole track there. You'll read a lot about it. It's D-Wave plus all the others who have joined that cause, including Google. So there's a nice article in Nature a few months ago. So this may or may not work. We don't know. We hope it works, but we don't honestly know. But even if it does, we don't see how it threatens cryptography. There's no known attack to cryptography with these non-fault tolerant devices. So I'm just flagging this because you will likely hear about this, and I don't want you to panic because you're hearing about advances in non-fault tolerant quantum computing. What you have to worry about for cybersecurity is advances in the fault-tolerant approach. The next big milestone, when this is achieved, if we're not at least well on our path towards a solution to protecting against the quantum threat, then I think many, many organizations will be too late because the scaling will happen too fast for a good response to happen in time. So we don't want to start when we hear, oh, we have a design and now we're focusing on scaling it. Because many top groups, and it's a fault-tolerant quantum computer that can help us design new materials and new drugs and more efficient fertilizer production and optimize, all sorts of different business processes and systems. And you'll see top groups around the world. This Christmas Eve paper a few months ago, just a few days ago, we saw the Intel announcement that this system is now a 17 physical bit system. Again, 17 doesn't sound like a lot, doesn't sound scary, but the point is they're trying to get the building block of a scalable system. And once they've demonstrated that building block and they have the design, then the focus will be on scaling. So our friends at Yale continue to work on it. These are our colleagues in China who just, to our knowledge, entered the game just over a year ago. And just a few days after I submitted these slides, we learned about the $10 billion investment from China in quantum computing and quantum metrology. Building on the work of these colleagues. So my colleague at Waterloo continues to thinking about scalable. It's not about doing sexy science, not just about that. They're really focused on engineering working quantum computers. IBM advertises its 16 and 17 qubit systems. There's a lot of media around this spin-based computer out of Australia. Right? So there's different physical platforms. We have a system. There might be an approach that works. It'll be maybe the ENIAC of quantum computers. In parallel, physicists continue to design smaller, faster, cheaper systems to scale, and they'll scale faster. We don't know which ones will cross the finish line first. So what's the bottom line? So a lot of really talented and well-resourced people continue to make progress towards the key milestones for a scalable quantum computer. And in '96, I said, you don't have to worry for next 20 years. Okay? There's plenty of time. Of course, we should work on the solution, but we don't need to panic. We have at least 20 years. But that quickly went from 0% to 5% to 50%, and I don't even talk about 20 years anymore. I talk about 10 to 15 years. And a couple years ago, I estimated a 1 in 7 chance These are the odds I take bets on that we break RSA within a decade, and even money within 15 years. And that probability's gone up. The 10-year probability continues to creep up. And I made this even before the recent announcements from Intel in China that I mentioned. I urged, this is in London last month at ETSI, IQC. We've been organizing a workshop in quantum safe crypto for the last 5 years. So this is what I mentioned there. I asked my colleague at Oxford to tell us what he thought. I didn't know what he was going to say. I urged him to say what he thought. He could have said, I don't think it'll happen for another 20 years. Instead, what he said was, he presented where the state of the art of the field, and he said, look, if somebody's willing to go Manhattan Project and invest $30 billion, it could happen in 6 to 12 years. If we continue at the current rate, it could take 15 to 25 years. And he said, this is my own speculative opinion, so he definitely qualified it. Scientists do not want to. This is what the risk managers want to know, but it's very, very hard to find anyone in the field who will actually give you their best guess, because it's far too speculative for our taste. And this is a few weeks before we heard, for example, that China was investing $10 billion in the quantum computing and metrology project, or institute or center. Microsoft, again, estimates, we could have a useful quantum computer within a decade. We probably need a few extra years to scale it up to be able to factor large numbers. But these are all roughly in the same ballpark. So roughly speaking, significant chance within 10 years, in my opinion and of a number of my colleagues, and very, very significant chance, more likely than not, I would say, in 15 years. So that's quite a few years away, but it actually doesn't give us much time to be properly ready. So what is the migration time? How long does it take us to get ready? Is this a weekend update? Right? No, not at all. So on the one hand, it's not that it's hopeless. It's not like we have no clue and there's just no way to fix it. But it's also not at the other extreme where we're done. Just go buy these products that have been out there already and validated and tested and standardized. No, it's definitely not going to be that easy. It's somewhere in between, where we have strong candidates. On paper, we have plug-in replacements for those cryptographic tools I mentioned. However, they do need a lot more work to be ready for showtime. Quantum mechanics, however, also gives us the ability, this is essentially about reestablishing the status quo. Where it works, there's always a chance that maybe there's a way to cryptanalyze it. We might need bigger keys. Or there's a small chance, but still non-zero, that the whole system could be decimated. We've been lucky so far that nothing that catastrophic to our knowledge has happened. But quantum cryptography can't be cryptanalyzed. So it's a wonderful new tool to add to the tool chest to just eliminate the risk of somebody recording your ciphertext, archiving it, and deciphering it later when they have the ability or desire to. So that's one thing that quantum cryptography helps with. Gives you longer-term more security and long-term confidentiality, and greater security against unexpected systemic collapse. Again, I see this as an addition to reestablishing the status quo. They work very well together. Okay. But I don't want to get into the technical details of how they work together. But we have the ability to not only reestablish the status quo, but make it better than it ever was before. So again, with quantum cryptography, the aim is we're building towards, what we often call the quantum internet. It'll be a subset of the global telecommunication system that allows you to communicate quantum bits. So it won't be the whole thing. There'll always be environments. I would imagine the majority of our communication system will not allow for practical communication of quantum bits. We don't know, but that's certainly not clear how that would happen anytime soon. But a subset of our global communications network will enable quantum cryptography. So we'll have the option for at least some parts of our infrastructure, some parts of the system can be enabled with these enhanced tools. So that's exciting. However, again, I want to repeat, there's a huge difference between me having a wonderful new system on my whiteboard and having it globally deployed ubiquitously through our ICT system. there's a lot of work to be done. For one, we still need to continue the cryptanalysis of these systems and make sure we have the right algorithms and we have the right key lengths. Very critical thing to get right before you deploy the system. We need to make sure all these systems work and interoperate, the performance is sufficient. We need a validation. We need to be able to validate and certify these tools. We're all moving in those directions, but none of this is fast or easy, and it does require the engagement of vendors and their customers. But there are glimmers of hope. I mean, for example, the ICMC conference has been having a session and now a track in the validation of quantum, the quantum threat and the solutions to it. Another glimmer of hope is, when the NSA a couple years ago announced that it was going to transition its Suite B of cryptographic protocols to quantum-resistant codes in the near future, in the not-too-distant future. The wording was something like that. And that initiated, so a consequence of that is that NIST launched its PostQuantum project. Deadline is in a few weeks in November, where groups from all around the world are going to submit their proposed new cryptographic algorithms. They'll be scrutinized for a few years, 3 years or so, and then standardized a few years after that. So we're looking at standards. This is not a promise that this is the final answer, but at least we'll have a few focused algorithms to focus on. Again, we've been working a lot with Etsy as well. Another, I've talked to vendors for a number of years, and about 5 years ago, I talked to a small vendor who totally, they dealt with file sharing, so they were worried about their customers having their files that are going through this allegedly secure file sharing system be recorded and cryptanalyzed in 10 to 15 years. They said, well, what can I do now? And there wasn't really much he could do other than think about it, because a small company can't afford a team of experts, crypto experts, to properly implement crypto. So we started planning, and we've deployed in the last couple of years an open source, sort of the open SSL of quantum-resistant cryptography, to allow organizations to test. You can even use it if you want in product or use it as a reference implementation, but to facilitate any organization for starting to plan and test solutions. Many organizations consider themselves conservative. They don't want to be the first adopters of new technology. They don't want to get fired for buying the new thing that no one else was using, right? So they're risk-averse, so they don't want to try this fancy new quantum stuff or quantum-resistant stuff, and that's not what we're actually saying. Okay? We don't recommend stop using the currently deployed robust systems that are very good at defending you against today's attacks. For the next couple decades, leave that in, but also add in a layer of quantum protection. Right? So encrypt it and then encrypt it again with both tools. Okay? So you're protected against today, anyone who has access to conventional attacks, but you also have the best available quantum attack. And if you do it the right way, you'll keep all your current certifications. So if you're risk averse, then you should definitely not ignore this risk. Okay? You need to manage it. So there's 3 basic steps. Identify how vulnerable you are to this threat, right? How do you rely on crypto? Where do you get your crypto? Track the threat and track the solution. How close are we to being compromised by quantum attacks? How ready are our vendors? Who are the vendors we should be talking to if we want to mitigate against these attacks? And manage it. Manage the part you can control. Talk to your vendors. Keep an eye on your own technology life cycle. You want to time it. You don't want this to be a disruption. Right? If in 7 years you're going to buy new hardware, you should think about, is that going to be the time when I buy hardware that's quantum ready? Or do I wait for another 7 years after that? Just make it part of your regular life cycle management. So the hardest part in managing this threat is, as hard as the technical part is, as is often the case with challenges to humanity, it's not the hardest part. Ultimately, deciding, security is something we need to decide. It needs to be planned, it needs to be prioritized, it takes years to deploy properly. It's a discipline. And there's some choices that have been advocated or I've heard articulated that worry me a lot. Okay? I talked to some customers with a lot at stake and they say, I don't really do crypto. I get my crypto from my vendors. They're going to have to take care of this for me. Then I talk to their vendors, and they understand the problem. They get it, and they say, yeah, but none of my customers are asking for this, so I'm not going to really invest too much time or energy in it. So they really need to start a dialogue. Another piece of advice I've heard, which worries me a lot, is don't do anything until NIST has standardized some primitives. I think it's important to recognize there's two things we need. We need a new building block, a robust, reliable, interoperable, trusted building block. But then we need to integrate it in very complex systems, legacy systems. There's evolving systems and future systems. This is, arguably as harder than the building block. They're both really, really hard, and we have to get both of them right. So you can definitely start the planning and preparing to adopt new crypto well before the new crypto is ready. Okay, most of that design and preparation, that groundwork can be done without knowing all the details of that building block. You can start testing potential building blocks, and you can provide feedback to the people making the building blocks, tell them, well, we need shorter signatures, or we need faster signatures, or whatever. But these are two largely compartmentalizable tasks that can and should be done in parallel. So don't wait till 2024 or 25 to then start thinking about, now how am I going to use this building block to protect my systems? And at the other extreme, I often get people asking me, well, what cipher should I use? Because I just want to, code it up and just get you off my back, so I don't have to listen to this quantum nonsense anymore. Well, that's risky too. That's the opposite of what all security experts are saying. They're saying keep your cryptography systems agile so we can adapt quickly. If there is a weakness discovered in a crypto algorithm, we can quickly fix it instead of having to go fix, baked in code. So getting it over with quickly with your best guess, because almost very, very likely any algorithm you pick today will not be one of the front runners 5 years from now. You'll be wishing you could change it. So it's fine to to deploy something today in addition to today's things, as long as you're ready to update it, to change it later. So I think organizations, you have to ask your own organization, do we have a plan? And it doesn't have to be a complicated or expensive plan. It could be one page for now, right? And somebody has to be responsible for it. You can't expect somebody to do this in their spare time at the expense of not achieving their KPIs. Right? Somebody has to be responsible for it, and their year-end bonus has to depend on whether they actually produce the plan and how good it is. You should be asking your vendors if they have a plan. Okay? It doesn't have to be a demanding expectation, but you should expect them to at least have some thoughts about, well, what are you doing? Are you ignoring it? Or are you planning to be ready? Are you already testing things? And you, as an industry, you often have to interoperate with all your competitors. So you want to make sure if there's some collaboration that's required, you can start that discussion now. Just like Bob Blakely, for example, is convening a working group on this through FSISAC from Citigroup. And these plans have to coordinate, have to work together. So you can start those dialogues earlier, set up the relationships and structures to manage this problem now, not when we're in the middle of a crisis. I'd also like to point out that managing the very basic, this is not rocket science, the very basic things we need to do to understand what this threat is, figure out what we need to do, work backwards, and get all that work done, start the relationships and the planning, that's just good for cyber security in general. Right? It'll give us a stronger cyber immune system and make us more ready to respond to other threats to cryptography and security in general. So right now, we're living on this historic infrastructure built since the 80s and 90s. We know it's very problematic, but there isn't this great political or business will to fix it. Quantum computing gives us a reason, not just an excuse, but a very, very important reason to fix it. And we have time to fix it right and make it stronger than it ever was. So I think we should take advantage of this, because as we'll hear in the next talk, there are many, many threats to our security. And they're changing every 6 months. I mean, the landscape, what the threat actors, who they are, what they're doing, is changing constantly. So we have enough we will continue to have enough problems on our hands. Having a strong basis, a strong cryptographic foundation, which again are the building blocks of all the tools we use to defend us, is a very, very valuable thing to have as we continue to face all the other threats. So thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm happy to take some questions. If you could maybe identify yourself when you ask the question.
Hi, I'm Will Carter with CSIS. I wanted to dig a little bit on the Z component of your equation.
Yeah.
You talk about it as if when that large-scale quantum computer exists, the threat will materialize, but
Yeah.
doesn't it have to be available to a large number of threat actors? I mean, you wouldn't assume that the first people that will have the opportunity to use these devices will be people who want to target your networks.
That's a very good point. So when you come up with your own plan and you do your own risk analysis, you do have to factor in what he just said, which is it's not just when the first computer exists, but when are threat actors going to start using it to attack your networks? And that's really part of your Z. So I'm talking about sort of the universal Z, which is kind of a lower bound when the first one is out. But then is it another year or 2 years or 10 years before they start using it to attack you? Well, I mean, as I saw from your talk earlier in the week, the threat changes so quickly, we certainly have no clue what cybercrime will be like in a decade from now. So what will be the gap? So first of all, you expect state actors to be obviously to have almost immediate availability, and they are a serious threat to not all of our infrastructures. They're not going to attack our coffee card system, but certainly there's the ability to steal billions of dollars, as you mentioned in your talk, from government, from the states, from other states. So that's a very serious threat for many, many people, certainly the global financial system. The other thing, there'll be a tension. It would just be terrible for humanity for there to be this tension between, the reason we're building quantum computers is because they solve important problems for humanity. And so we want people designing new materials to save energy and so on to have access to them. So once you start giving access to the computers, you're not going to realistically, I don't think, in the first stage, you're not going to sell them a full-fledged computer. You might, but you're going to give access to the handful of computers that are available in the world. And once you start giving access to some people, sufficiently motivated threat actors will also get access. Again, it won't be cheap. So you have to do this analysis and say, when will the threat actors I'm worried about get access to it? And obviously you have to add a small number of years to that, but I don't think it'll be decades, because we have an internet now. There are use cases for computers. It's not like the 40s and 50s. So it's a very good point, and that definitely goes into our analysis when we talk to people about how quickly they need to move.
In simple language, what does quantum computing do from a present-day normal server that we have in our data centers? Where does that take us in terms of processing power? So we can calculate quite quickly at the moment from a processing payments for global payments, etc. But just to give us an idea of the scale that will be capable once a quantum computer is accessible.
You mean, so I've just been saying, look, it's this wonderful device, it'll solve these important things for material design and optimization and so on, but we need to mitigate the threat. And you're saying, but can the banking community use it, or can the data, the ICT industry use quantum computers to solve some of its current pain points?
Yeah, I'm just trying to make a comparison to say this is where we are right now. We've got these 3.2 gigahertz, 42 terabyte servers. Where does quantum computing place us in comparison to what we have now?
We have to be careful, because it's a very special kind of computing capacity. Like, if you look inside today's computers, many different kinds of chips, right? There's graphics cards, there's storage memory, there's RAM. And this is yet another very, very specialized kind of memory that only speeds up very certain tasks. So it's not a general purpose replacement for our existing servers. We'd have to really study, are there any real computational bottlenecks that you face where a quantum computer is especially equipped to solve it. And it's actually not easy to find these niches where they really speed things up. But when they do, it can be a really astronomical, game-changing speed up. So whose organization has a plan in place already, or at least a half-page plan? Who? Yeah, okay, great. And whose organization needs a plan in the next year? So that's ultimately what I urge every organization to do, is have a point person and just give them the executive support they need. It doesn't have to be a lot, but don't punish them for spending the time to figure out what this means to your organization and articulating on a page or two what the next step should be. And have it in writing so everyone's going to be accountable for what the decisions they made 10 years, 5 years from now even. We know what the decision process was that got us to that state. Well, thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you, Michelle.